Thank you, David, and thanks to CUF, the Architectural League, and the Revson Foundation for jointly sponsoring this work. We're delighted to be part of the study. I'm Karen Fairbanks of Marble Fairbanks Architects. I'm joined here with Leah Meisterlin and James Lima. We are re-envisioning New York's branch libraries as one networked system. I'm going to begin by introducing 3 principles of our team's work. We need to change how we approach the planning of our libraries. We need to shift how New York City envisions its libraries from independent branches to one networked system in order to most optimally plan for the future of our libraries. When we consider the 207 branch libraries as interrelated parts of one system, and when we recognize that the system is not flat, that needs and services are unevenly distributed in the city, we can more equitably allocate resources in relationship to demand. When we think about the libraries as a networked system, we can make policy responses that are not on a per-branch basis, but rather we can bring multi-branch responses to pressing citywide concerns. As an underfunded yet vibrant and vital public resource that needs significant investment just to be preserved, the branch library has been heavily leaned on to fill various social service gaps in the city. Once we conceive of libraries as a network system of social infrastructure related to other public services, the libraries can help address both citywide systemic issues and respond to the local needs of their neighborhoods. Now, we are all aware that there are 3 library systems in New York City, but we believe that considering the branch libraries as one network system in the planning process is in the best public interest, making more connected and responsive, more relevant, and more equitable decisions with limited resources. We need new tools for planning. In order to intelligently plan within this networked infrastructure, we have developed new tools that can utilize comparative and relational data so that any one branch in the network is planned with an awareness of other branches. With these tools, we can utilize the vast amounts of data available to help visualize opportunities and balance priorities. We can more easily connect library planning to citywide phenomena that directly affect the use and programming of the libraries, such as location of future growth areas or emerging freelancer economies. And we can locate opportunities for the development of our libraries by linking our planning to other initiatives, such as resiliency planning and affordable housing co-development. Our tools can be used to measure impacts, providing a potent communications tool for library advocacy, particularly when the city budget is being negotiated and hard choices must be made about our resource allocations. This is a new way to plan for the most strategic deployment of public resources based on layers of data that are available and related to our collective goals. Goals such as greater access to education and human services, wellness, skills training, support for vulnerable populations, and catalyzing socioeconomic improvement. Finally, all this is to acknowledge that we can and should take actions to strengthen the library's position as a community hub, as a significant anchor of the neighborhood it serves. Libraries are accelerators within their neighborhoods, generative places supporting personal growth and communal well-being, public life. With increasing information, we can plan for our libraries to meet current and future user needs. We can know more about our users, and we know more about system-wide trends that can support planning and design efforts. And we can design our libraries to be more porous and transparent, more inviting and more inclusive. And as part of the social infrastructure of the city, supporting social growth and social equity, we are also proposing enhancing community engagement around the reinvestment in our libraries and actionable policy mechanisms, specifically in relationship to co-development opportunities, to further increase the value of our libraries for the public good. Our research is structured in 3 parts. Part 1, Data City, is about the tool we've developed that allows us to make complex planning decisions using various data sets and indices in order to plan differently. Part 2, Zoning Neighborhoods, is about the opportunity to increase the public benefit of our libraries through co-development strategies and broader public initiatives in support of the libraries. And Part 3, Users Building, utilizes the data for a specific site in a unique neighborhood and presents a building that expands the library while also addressing pressing citywide needs.
Good morning. I'm Leah Meisterlin, and I'm going to walk us through briefly part one, Data City, before we start zooming in, I think. So first off, as Karen mentioned, we have a system of 207 branches throughout the three systems throughout the city, which are normally or often considered in sort of an isolated or siloed manner, each branch sort of serving its individual neighborhood. And we our research is advocating for an approach that looks at it as one network system serving a city of, our New York as a city of neighborhoods. When we adopt a wider scaled approach, we can leverage the city's data. For example, we have data that can plan libraries in relation to, in this case, an example of visitor counts, an example of contextualizing data already connected or collected by the systems about each branch. We also have data that can plan libraries in relation to locally needed services. In this example, we're looking at job and work-related data sets, comparing the needs of the growing freelance economy with the needs of populations who may need adult education for work. We also have data that can plan libraries in relation to the city's trending growth. In a city that is growing, we have to also acknowledge that it is growing unevenly and plan for that in the future. Okay. And thus, we have proposed and designed a new tool for more informed planning, one that takes into account a networked systems-based approach for decision support to help libraries, library managers, branch managers, and policymakers in their efforts for more informed and effective planning. Our tool includes the following data sets. And this, of course, is just the tip of the possible iceberg. This is a list of several compiled data sets that are both open and readily accessible in our work as a sort of pilot. And specifically, our tool seeks to aid decision-making by comparing a variety of these available data sets at once, rather than singling one or two out at a time, which is how we often sort of gauge our priorities. It is, in essence, multivariable and allows decision makers to compare both different and differing priorities, as well as to construct different planning scenarios, right? So I'm going to quickly walk through 3 examples of how one might use such a tool, and in so doing, we'll look at a collection of 6 different sites that Jim will later zoom into at the neighborhood scale. Okay, so for starters, we can use our tool and data more generally to find out more about the existing branch libraries. We'll take as a point of example Grand Concourse branch in the Bronx and Rego Park in Queens. So just to repeat, for instance, we can look at the existing visitor counts and contextualize those, by the local population density to get a sort of visits per capita. We can also examine our branches relative to their local neighborhood growth trends. This map you're seeing is itself a compiled indicator, including data sets on percent change in population, local building density growth, and now allowable FAR, taking into account upzoning and planned growth. We can also use data to find out about local community diversity, including a variety of demographic indicators. In this case, we're looking, since we're zoomed out at the city scale, not so much about specific demographics, but the extent to which communities are diverse or homogeneous, such that branches can plan accordingly. We can also identify primary and critical user groups. In this case, we're looking at the distribution of the senior population across the city. Our second use case example for the tool is to attempt to find or identify new sites for branch development, and in this case, we'll be filling in those 2 boxes. With me, I like it, okay. So for brevity, I'm going to repeat a couple of these indicators, so I'm not explaining multiple data sets over and over again. So once again, if we're going to think about where to place a new branch, we should think about where the city's population is moving and or expanding. So we've included, again, growth trends since 2000 at the neighborhood scale in this analysis. We also should consider the areas that are sort of geographically underserved at the moment. So this is the density of existing branches as well as the sort of transit accessibility. To that, we should add development potential. We're talking about building a new building. So the ability to do that would be of utmost importance. And with our tool, we can relate these different layers. They are themselves compiled indices, and we can layer them together and start to identify areas worthy of more attention at a finer grain or zoomed in at the neighborhood level. Once layered together, the yellow sort of indicates high score neighborhoods. But we can take that one step further. I promise you, we can compare priorities and construct different scenarios and weight the layers to further isolate our efforts. In this case, for sake of discussion, we're going to zoom into the South Bronx. And we've identified 2 possible locations, which Jim will discuss further. Lastly, the third example, or use case example, is using data to align our existing libraries with some of the city's most pressing needs. In this case, we're going to talk about co-development of housing as well as planning for environmental resiliency. And once again, we're going to fill in those 2 boxes, but this time with branches rather than non-branch sites. So I won't walk us through the layering all over again, but we'll say we're looking at some of the indicators in identifying areas for housing opportunity, again, growth trends and development potential, as well as existing population density. And we're going to add to that and thus prioritize and isolate the branches with the greatest need for environmental resiliency planning, or neighborhoods with the greatest need. That is a compiled index including city data and FEMA data. And I should note at this point that within the city's evacuation zones, currently we have 74 individual branches within those zones. Their capital funding needs to reach a state of good repair is approximately $264 million combined. There are an additional 75 branches within a half-mile walking distance from the evacuation zones. That's 149 out of 207. Okay, and with these 4 layers, we can identify areas, again, worthy of further consideration, and for the sake of discussion, we'll zoom into South Brooklyn and the Rockaways, comparing Brighton Beach, the branch, and the Peninsula branch. You see the bar charts include their relative scores on those 4 layers, and recalling the first use case, we can go further using the tool and identify some critical local demographics and branch stats for further planning. With that, I'm going to pass it on to James Lima to zoom into the neighborhood scale.
Thanks, Leah. Good morning. The good news is that New York is not a shrinking city. It's poised to grow by 1 million people in the next generation, so there's enormous opportunity. But in the context of that ever-shifting demographic, and in thinking about the ever-changing ways that New Yorkers live, work, collaborate, study, play, how can these community hubs become increasingly relevant to the lives of an increasingly diverse group of people, and how then can libraries have a more central place in the social, economic, and political discourse, which is to say, to the extent that we are now going to look at some potential land use, finance, and zoning options, how can communities who are key players in the political discussion really take greater ownership and think of these central hubs as even more relevant in the future than they are today. And I think we saw a lot of really inspiring work already about how relevant they are and where the opportunities are. So we really want to talk about how we can, through design, create more porous and transparent places that literally are more connected, physically, but also psychologically. And again, sort of in terms of, sort of the political discussion about where funding priorities are and where value can both be captured and in some cases created and redirected back into public benefit projects like this. A comparable, effort, of course, is the current thinking about affordable housing production through stimulative upzonings citywide. So these are just some illustrative examples. I'm just going to give you a few examples of where we identified sites that have intrinsic value today from a real estate and redevelopment perspective, but also where some specific actions can be taken. And again, these are not meant to be prescriptive. The idea is that there is value to be unlocked, community development potential to be achieved, very much involving community engagement. So here, this diagram is really just to address the fact that we are going to be looking at life at street, which involves retail and commercial and community facility uses, in some cases open space, but also the potential for co-development of new residential, in some cases light industrial and office on upper floors. We looked at 6 illustrative sites: Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, a peninsula site in Queens in the Rockaways, the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, Rego Park, Queens, and 2 sites in the South Bronx. The as-of-right potential is indicated at the top of each of those sites. So one area of possible zoning modification, and again, it's meant to be illustrative. Our notion here is that the city has a lot of different tools available to it in terms of zoning changes, special permit process, modifications processes, large-scale plans. So we throw these out just to suggest that there are some potential changes that, if we've all collectively decided that libraries are increasingly important as a New York City public policy priority, then does that help change the context within which we think about possible land use changes? So at this site, a split lot, which is both R6 and R7 zone, if a minor modification allowed for the entire library site to be redeveloped as R7, the development potential means an additional 10 to 15 residential units, so an additional 1 FAR bonus. For a site at the Peninsula site in Queens, similarly, the R5B to R5D would increase the FAR by 0.65, and it would increase the lot coverage by 25%, allowing for another 10 to 15 units on a site that's still relatively low scale and contextual. For a site in the South Bronx, extending adjacent high-density districts, in this case, there's sort of a kind of a jigsaw zoning line today. If we move that line over from R6 to allow the M12 zone to extend to the existing library site there, we would actually be able to gain 2 FAR of manufacturing. And there's a lot of thinking now about how light industry, makers, light industrial space that has, controlled performance standards might coexist with residential development. And so that's an intriguing opportunity to us to think about maximizing the potential for that site. In Rego Park, extending an adjacent high-density development district in an area that is extremely well served by transit, that has fairly high density context. This particular site, this library, is at the head of the proposed Queensway Park. There are a lot of elements here that suggest that a more high density and civic building could be appropriate. By shifting from the existing R4 and moving the line of an R7, again, just illustrative, we would gain 2.54 FAR and allow for 18 more residential units and a significantly larger library branch. Actually, today, the existing 18,000 square foot library that we're assuming goes on each of these sites is not permissible. So this would allow the full-size branch library. increasing community FAR, 1.7 more FAR for community facility, some additional residential units as well. This really addresses the questions of it being along a retail corridor and allowing additional value to be created both in terms of its land use and its development potential. For Brighton Beach, this is a site a block off of the ocean. It's next to a subway station. And here we're looking at the R71 being changed to the R72, allowing a 1.7 community facility FAR bonus. And it allows a significant amount of new commercial, which has important implications both for the ability to build a full-size library, but just as an illustrative example, this site at 24,000 square feet of additional retail potential at this location could generate as much as $5 million in land revenues based on comparable land sales in the area. We'll look at this site in detail when Karen goes back and shows a potential redevelopment plan. I can just tell you, having researched land sale comparables in sites, including this one, we got an unsolicited all-cash offer for this site of $12 million. So there is definitely potential out there. So planning for property assemblage, this is not necessarily suggesting any particular action be taken, but it's interesting to look at a site like Rego Park and say, in its larger context, if we were thinking about the potential for these locations that are within the control of the library system, if you thought about it like a real estate developer would think about it, and maybe David can comment on this, there's a very low intensity use adjacent to this site, a one-story commercial use that could potentially be assembled. And again, if the community felt strongly about enhancing the significance and the potential for this site, one might think about a zoning modification and an assemblage that allowed for a significantly greater number of residential units, in this case 100 additional residential units and 34,000 square feet of retail. You know, in our 18th century American settlements, the church steeple was the sort of defining element, and we'd like to think that in many of these sites we can, you know, increase, if not physically, at least psychologically have these library sites and any co-development that goes with it be really the kind of the central defining organizer, both of community activity, but to the extent that parks do this, whether it's Central Park or the High Line or others, become more of an organizer of residential development and of other economic investment because they are such important quality of life amenities in places. A subdivision of R8, this is a site in the Grand Concourse. This is just to illustrate that on a number of these sites, we have relatively small footprints, and so in some cases, the as-of-right development potential, which you see on the left, is somewhat awkward and not necessarily additive to the community context, but with some minor modification, whether it's, you know, rezoning or, you know, possibly a special permit process or some other kind of modification process. A better building might be possible that also has the effect of creating a larger square footage potential, in this case 15 more units and higher FAR and community facility. And then to the extent that sites that have libraries or have new libraries meet resiliency standards and could potentially become centers of emergency response and sort of safe havens for the community, that there would be a certain performance standard that would generate a zoning bonus. And so in this case, again, we're showing Brighton Beach as being that site, which would generate a 1 FAR community facility bonus, which in this case generates at least 10 to 15 more residential units. And then just thinking somewhat out of the box and somewhat ambitiously, and I'm sure there'll be a million reasons why this doesn't work, what if we said that within, let's say, a quarter mile walking distance or quarter mile physical distance from every single branch library, we would designate a public library benefit zone. And within that geographically defined benefit zone, as new building permits and new economic activity, real estate development occurs, there'd be some kind of fee or assessment that would require that funds be paid into a dedicated library benefit fund to support operations citywide and go to the whole system. So that's just sort of a sampling of where we think there is potential to be unlocked, and look forward to discussing this further with you. Karen's going to go into more specifics on that Brighton Beach example. Thank you.
Thanks. So the final section, we're going to look at Brighton Beach. We know that the Brighton Beach Library is 50 years old and currently has $4.7 million in capital needs, and it's smaller than desired. We also know that the Brighton Beach, we also know a lot about the Brighton Beach community. There's a low racial diversity index, and it's predominantly white. There's a high percentage of an aging population and a low percentage of minors. The local population is 66% foreign-born, and almost 80% don't speak English at home. 30% receive SNAP benefits, 53% can't afford housing costs. So from the previous analysis that Leah took you through, we also know that if you look at sites where the library needs meet a need for resilience planning and there are opportunities for co-development, the Brighton Beach site stands out. But when designing for Brighton Beach, we can also look at the relationship between that branch and the two nearest branches, Coney Island and Sheepshead Bay. Brighton Beach has a lower percentage of households with children, but Coney Island and Sheepshead Bay both have averages above the city average, percentages above the city average. Brighton Beach has more visits per capita than the other two branches. Both Brighton Beach and Sheepshead Bay have high percentage of foreign-born population at 66% and 60%, and Coney Island's at 39%. So these are just some of the comparative data that's available when you're thinking about one branch and its relationship to the adjacent ones. All this data, though, is tied to real people with real stories and real needs. It's alive, so to speak. Stella, Max, Myra, and Igor, Sergey, and Neil are 6 characters that you can find in this community. They are all future users of this project, and they provide some context for our design. We took full advantage of all the zoning opportunities that James just outlined, and tried to address citywide priorities such as resiliency planning and affordable housing. So we proposed a new library, commercial spaces, and housing for the Brighton Beach site. The library is the focus of the building. It's located primarily on the 2nd floor. It's also a significant piece of New York's resiliency planning designed to support the community during events such as Sandy. The library connects the street with an entry, an event space, a community room, a book drop, programming kiosks. New commercial wraps the corner of the street and encompasses most of the 1st and 3rd floors, and we've designed for opportunities for interesting synergies between the commercial space and the library. The building takes advantage of the prominent site with views to the ocean and on the upper floors of the housing, and there's a green roof for the tenants, an outdoor reading garden as some of the shared amenities. So Stella's 65. We know that there are more than double the citywide percentage of seniors in this neighborhood. She's foreign-born, and she has a high school education. Almost 80% in this community do. She doesn't want to retire, so she uses the library to retool for new job opportunities. The library focuses on supporting the aging population with appropriate materials and programming. So she's headed here into the library for a computer class. Max is a motivated teen who lives in the neighborhood, and we know that Brighton Beach, as I said, has fewer households with children than the city average. So he uses the library for computers at this branch, but he likes to go to the nearby branches, Sheepshead Bay and Coney Island, because he'll find large groups of peers there and extended teen programming. Myra and Igor are an elderly Russian couple. They don't speak English at home. As I mentioned, 80% of the population of Brighton Beach doesn't, and also almost 60% say they don't speak English well at all. So they have young grandchildren, though, that they want to speak English with. They use the library regularly for ESL classes. They're here in the community room on the ground floor. Sergey is a mid-career 40-year-old. He wants to become an entrepreneur, but we actually know this isn't prevalent in this neighborhood. Statistically, only a small number of residents work at home or are self-employed. So Sergey uses the library to expand his education through online courses and access to important databases. As a library user, he has access to the 24-hour community room at the street level, and he uses it regularly for his evening meetings. Neil is a recent immigrant. He's a local chef who lives in the building. His passions are related to food and healthy living, including gardening. That leads him to volunteer at the library to help support their outdoor reading garden, and the branch manager recently convinced him to start offering healthy cooking classes to their senior patrons. His apartment here, he lives in the building, his apartment overlooks the green roof. So the project will have a significant impact on the community. We've expanded the library to support demonstrated community needs. We've added to the affordability of the neighborhood by including affordable housing in the development. We've enlivened the street with more commercial uses. We've increased access to open space and green space, and we've contributed to the resiliency planning of the city. We can take advantage of the unique attributes of the site to make a realizable proposal for the library and a co-development that has significant public benefits. But because the site is understood and modeled as part of a networked system and not a standalone library, the decisions of how we develop it ripple through the whole system, strengthening and rebalancing it. So for instance, in 3 final slides here, if we plan for our libraries to be integral to the city's approach to resilient planning, as Leah said, we know we have 74 branches in the evacuation zone and 75 within a half-mile walk. That's 149 branches that could be planned that could be positioned to support New York's efforts in this area. We have a fairly evenly distributed set of senior centers in the city and an unevenly distributed aging population. If we can locate other branches that are strategically positioned as Brighton Beach is to help play an expanded role in supporting our senior populations. Our branch libraries form a rich network of public space and public services throughout the city. We believe there's much more we can do with this valuable piece of social infrastructure. So we should shift how New York City envisions its libraries from independent branches to one system. We can use new tools for planning that help us visualize and balance priorities, and we can take actions to help strengthen the library's position as a hub of the community. Thank you.
Thank you.